everyone. I'm Claire, one of the volunteers from Southsea Sangha. This is the first time I've ever done something like this, so I'm noticing a big sense of nervousness. My body is shaking, my heart's racing, I'm sweating, and this is really important to me. So this isn't going to stop me from spending the evening with you guys. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I can see there's quite a few of you logged in so far. It's really nice that although we can't be together in person, actually we can still practice together in this way. And although personally I stay away from like modern technology as much as possible, this strange situation we're in has forced me to actually engage in this sort of way, which feels deeply uncomfortable, but actually getting finding a surprising connection online with people. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and a warm welcome to Stacie. So this evening session is going to be led by Dr. Stacie C.C. Graham. And she's going to be leading a guided practice and giving a Dharma talk on the art of surrender, let go and live. Stacie is the founder of Oya Body, Mind, Spirit Retreats. So welcome, Stacie. She cultivates community and creates spaces in which underserved and undervalued members of society have an opportunity to simply be. So let me just give you all a brief overview of tonight's session and format. It's going to be 1.5 to 2 hours long, which usually gives us time for guided meditation, a Dharma talk, and some time near the end for some questions. And if you have a look on your screen, for those that aren't familiar, at the bottom, it's got Ask a Question. So if you click on that tab at any point during this evening, you can just type in questions for Stacie to answer later on. And it will save them there, and we'll refer back to them after the Dharma talk. And please keep using the chat to communicate amongst yourselves. So before I hand over to Stacie, I'd just like to say thank you all for joining us again. And, it's really important that we can continue to share this online practice together. And we can't do that without your support. So if you feel able to offer support by donating to us, for Southsea Sangha and to Stacie for her time, then please, if you click on the Offer Dana donation button at the bottom, and I'm also going to post a link in the chat shortly, and then you can offer whatever you can to support us to continue with this great work. Although we've moved online, we still have quite a few costs to cover, so any your generosity, anything you can offer us is gratefully received. Thank you. So thanks for joining us, Stacie. I'm going to hand over to you now, and I will pop back in later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire. And good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. I know that we have people who are joining us from different parts of the world. Thank you for joining me, the Southsea Sangha, and greater community for this collective practice, talk, and discussion. As Claire mentioned, we'll be discussing our understanding of the notions of control and uncertainty. When I was asked if I'd be open to giving a talk, the first thing I thought about was the false sense of control that we as humans like to build into our minds and our lives. And it's something that I have been directly confronted with for the last 8 years or so. And in that time, my relationship to trying to control and plan every aspect of my life has shifted. But somehow I was really resistant to choosing the topic. After giving it thought for a couple of weeks and reaching out to friends for their input, I somewhat released my resistance and saw that it was really the only theme that I truly felt called to speak on right now. So as Claire already explained, we're going to start with a guided practice, and we'll then move into a talk where I'll be offering you some prompts that you can take back with you into your daily lives. And at the end, we'll have plenty of time for feedback, conversation, and questions that you'd like to bring into this space that we're creating and holding together. Just one last thing before we start with our practice. I'd like to mention that it's really important to me to hold space with inclusion and accessibility front of mind. So much of what I'll be talking about is it's rooted in my personal mindfulness practice, but my talk itself is framed in a mostly secular way because I know that this invitation has been extended to communities that include people of different faiths as well as no particular faith. Now let's go inward. If you're seated on the floor, you may want to change the cross of your legs. If you're on a chair or on the sofa, I'd encourage you to bring both feet to the floor so that you can root yourself, ground yourself through your feet. And if you're seated on the floor, also through your sit bones. And take a moment here to find a posture that is comfortable because we'll be sitting here for the next 30 minutes or so. Be sure to take back support if you need it. And just really find a comfortable position. That's the most important. Rolling your shoulders down and away from your ears, allowing your spine to straighten into its natural curve. Just so you know, I will be muting myself in the longer pauses so that you can focus on your own breath and your own environment, but I'm still here with you. Do not worry. So when you've found your seat, I'd encourage you to gently close your eyes or lower your gaze and begin by tuning in to your breath without trying to control its rhythm or depth. If focusing on the breath isn't comfortable for you at this time, for whatever reason, bring your attention into the body. Your awareness can follow the sensations throughout the body, such as cold, heat, pressure, tension, heaviness, lightness, as well as the sounds and smells of the space in which you find yourself. Simply notice these. allow the body as an open space of awareness to remind us that we are in control of none of it, but in relationship with all of it. The prickles, the tingles, the tightness, and the thoughts that continue to arise without any effort. Observe these without attaching to or rejecting them. As thoughts arise, acknowledge them and then let them go again. Notice the feeling of coming back from being lost in thought. Bring your awareness into the area of your body just below your navel. Notice the sensations in this part of your body, just below the navel. Utilizing the wisdom of the concept of hara, which originates in Japanese culture. Your hara can be found in this part of your body just below your navel. Notice if it is possible to feel into your power, your center, feeling into this center free of any miss or distrust of yourself, of your knowledge, of your wisdom, of your intuition. As thoughts arise, simply bring your attention back into hara, your body center. Your knowledge, your wisdom, your intuition, your power, your center. Release from holding your awareness in Hara, your center, and bring your attention to your breath and body. Now gently allow your awareness to be focused at the crown of your head. Notice the sensations in this part of the body. Feel into the expansiveness of the energy radiating from the crown of the head. What becomes possible when you connect the power into which you tapped with your Hatha practice to the crown of your head, connecting those energies? Notice the sensory experience between these 2 points or areas of your body. in control of none of it, but in relationship to all of it. Gently release yourself from this directed awareness and simply bring your attention back into the body, the many sensations, the sounds around you, and the smells, as well as the breath. As we bring this practice to a close, allow your breath to become more intentional, perhaps a bit deeper. And feel into where you are in this moment. Gently opening your eyes, raising your gaze. Welcome again. You may want to have a bit of a stretch. I do. Or change the cross of your legs, whatever you need in this moment. I titled this talk, The Art of Surrender. And I know that surrender is a word that evokes different responses depending on the person. Some may worry about the boundary to complacency, which is surely something that I personally am often concerned with. Others may feel like it's asking you to give up something or everything altogether. But the word surrender for me it's very personal. It came to me at the beginning of the year as the word that would accompany me throughout 2020. And there was resistance, obviously. And of course, now, at the time, I couldn't have expected that willingly or unwillingly, this word would accompany much of the world's population, at least at some point in this year. I would like for us to have a common understanding of the word surrender for the context of this space that we're sharing together, as the relinquishing of the illusion of reins. So in setting aside that illusion, we can have a more honest relationship with ourselves. And our actions are perhaps given the room to become more intentional. Our desire to control every aspect of our lives is such a huge topic. I obviously won't be able to cover many important and surely interesting points that come up for you. But more than anything, I'd like to offer you some themes for further reflection that you can take back with you into your daily life. So just as a warm-up, I would, now that we've done this guided practice, a question: when it comes to your body, what do you believe you can control? So just take a moment and think about it. When it comes to your body, what do you believe you can control? So without getting into more controversial points, we can look at little things. So a kind of thing for me is I surely can never control when my stomach decides to growl right when things go super silent in a meeting at work. But, we also have our eyes that blink, our heart beats, our lungs in and deflate, all without our having to do anything, thankfully. So I start with the body because I will continue to come back to the body. And the embodiment of practice is the source of its continuous integration into our lives and actions. So I've thought about 3 points of control that I'd like to use to open up this discussion of control and uncertainty. And the first point is control as conditioned or socialized behavior. I'm aware that people are joining from many different parts of the world. And at the same time, I do believe it's safe to assume that from an early age, we're all taught the importance of control from teachers, caretakers, and others. Can you remember the first time that your behavior was sanctioned, perhaps even publicly? And that moment being an aha moment for what is socially acceptable and not. So maybe it wasn't the first time, but it's the time that you remember where your behavior was sanctioned in such a way where you were like, oh, okay, now I get it. Or maybe you grew up having pets and you have memories of teaching your pet right from wrong behavior with a reward system. So a pet gets a treat when it does what is right and maybe gets a timeout when it doesn't do what's right. Without wanting to judge our upbringings as right or wrong, what we can say is that it served a purpose, or maybe even a few purposes. Social cohesion that has been necessary for humankind's survival has at the same time been transformed into something else entirely today. So if or when we as adults take the time to reassess those values passed on to us as children, we have to first recognize that we, to some extent, agreed to the lessons. And when I use the word agree, I'm referring to the use of the word in the Four Agreements, where it's described as there's so much that came before us. And so in our names, our language, our moral values, all of these things that were passed on to us, we had to agree to in order to store that information. And it doesn't mean that we agree to it enthusiastically. It's not the use of the word here. For many of us, it might have been a part of surviving the environments in which we grew up in. But at the same time, there's much from that upbringing that we've accepted, that we've taken on, and seeing truth in the values that were handed down to us. And today there are likely some values that you've rejected and others that you wholeheartedly defend, right? And I always ask, to what end? And I would say to control. So when we reject certain values, moral systems that we grew up with, we do that because we want to conjure a feeling of self-autonomy, that we have control over our own selves and opinions, motivations. And similarly, when we embrace value systems, we do that because it's important in belonging and maintaining our social standing. Again, not bringing value judgment as in this is right or this is wrong, this is good, this is bad. We can see now, for example, that conditioned behavior still has a really important function to play in society's survival. Had the majority of us not accepted or agreed to these value systems, then we would not see people adhering to government guidance across the many countries, right? So obviously not everyone does, and certainly not to 100%, but a large enough majority is adhering to making it possible for the guidance to lead to intended results, flattening of curves, limiting people's exposure to this new virus, preventing an overwhelm of the healthcare system. So there is obviously, like I said, there's important functions that it serves. And at the same time, there are perhaps downsides in that early socialization of control is something that we buy into. We buy into it, and then we seek to control in ways that perhaps don't support our collective connectedness, which is my second point, control as a method to project self-worth. So we work really hard to control the narrative of who we are. And that narrative shifts depending on where we find ourselves, what context, what environments, where we are geographically. And some of you might in this moment feel a great deal of resistance to the notion of doing that to project self-worth. And that's okay. I just ask you to sit with that for now. People who experience marginalization will know that the narrative they shape at work, for example, will certainly include projecting competence, intelligence, adding value, and so on. And that burden is structural and societal. It is not only a personal burden. But the underlying motive is to give no room to anyone to deny us our place in that company or on that team. So in other words, that is our self-worth. But it's not only marginalized people who work hard at shaping their narratives at work or in other parts of life, but the pressure we have to do, the pressure that we experience in doing so is different. So just to give you a really tangible example, there's a study that shows that in order for women to be evaluated as competent in the workplace, they must also be perceived as warm. So the equation is warmth plus competence equals competence. I guarantee a woman doesn't have to read that study to know that. She experiences that when her male peers, colleagues, subordinates, and managers even react negatively toward her when or even take credit for her ideas, speak over her in meetings, don't listen to her at all. there are plenty of examples. So instead of stepping into direct confrontation, which she might also do, she delivers her presentations differently. She works behind the scenes to garner buy-in. She studies the unspoken rules and political nuances of hierarchy. And all of this because there's a narrative that has to be created. There are probably many of you on the call who are working from home while caretaking. And I wonder how you are finding balance. Do you work in an environment where you feel comfortable saying that your schedule is maybe disjointed? Is it important to uphold appearances that you're working the same hours as your colleagues? Or are you able to say that, you know, you wake up early or you stay up late, or sometimes you just don't get everything done right now? Or is saying something like that admitting to something, or admitting that something is wrong even? In general, we as humans often seek our sense of value through external validation. In interaction with human beings, we look for approval. Work is, of course, just one place, an important environment, and an existentially defining environment for many of us, where we spend also perhaps the most consistent amount of time each day. But it's also in our personal relationships with friends, partners, lovers, and others, where we're really sensitive to anything that we read as rejection. And so from childhood, we're learning how to read other people, right? Beginning with our caretakers. And also just kids. It's not even just our caretakers, right? It's the people that we grew up around, because kids can be brutally honest. We might still be holding on to painful experiences that shaped how we presented ourselves to the world. Some of you have probably heard the word trauma-informed, and I think it's a really important word, but I personally don't use it often because it relies on a definition that defines trauma as a big event. And I would counter that trauma depends on the person. If you experience some form of betrayal or mistrust as a child, that's okay to see that as trauma. Or at least as something that stayed with you and affected the way that you engage for a longer period of time. I often tell a story from my own childhood as an example. So at my elementary school, we had show and tell on Fridays, which if you're not familiar with that, it just means that you bring something and then you talk about it. And one Friday, I brought a new stuffed animal to show. My aunt had given it to me. It was just a little bear. It wasn't anything special. And I actually still own it today. And the teacher went out of the room and someone asked if they could see it. Show and tell was over. Someone said, "Hey, can I see your bear?" So I kind of threw it to them. And it quickly became a game. The bear was tossed from like one person to the other and happened to land back in my lap right when the teacher came back into the room. And she was furious for reasons that I still honestly can't fully understand today, but she was really mad about it. And everyone became quiet and I took the blame, which is fine, fair. It was my bear and I was throwing it. So my punishment, which was announced in front of the entire class, was that I wasn't allowed to play with anyone at recess. And that wasn't a problem for me. I like to play by myself. I was like, cool, I can do that. And so I'm at recess, I'm minding my own business, and two girls walk over to me And I'm trying to tell them, go away. Like I'm not allowed to play with anyone. And of course, in that moment, my teacher came over to yell at me because in her eyes, I was disobeying. So I was sent to the principal's office. I got a paddling for disobedience. And because I was punished, my mother was also informed. So you can see, like, I have a lot of details to this story, but this story is like from second grade. And I can still remember these details. I'm also known to remember a lot of things, but, and of course, in the greater scheme of things, some of you might even be rolling your eyes, like, what is the point of this? But it's a pretty insignificant thing from looking from the outside, right? But in like the bigger scheme of life, but it's something that I never forgot. I never forgot how I felt that my peers didn't speak up for me, especially the two girls who came over to talk to me at recess. I never forgot how I felt when my teacher was so unwilling to listen to me. And also the lesson that my mother taught me. For her, it didn't matter if she believed me or not. In her eyes, I had created a scene in school. So take a moment and consider if there's a lesson that you can remember, perhaps from childhood, but not necessarily so, that still informs the way you present or engage with people today. I'm going to sit here in silence and you can take a moment and just go with whatever comes to you first. So my last point is control as a rebuke of vulnerability. In preparing for this talk, I always do this. In preparing for this talk, I looked up the word vulnerability, and I always think it's great to use the dictionary in preparation. And I was really surprised to find the definition. So I used just the online edition of Merriam-Webster. And there were only definitions with extremely negative connotations for the word. Some examples were capable of being physically or emotionally wounded, open to attack or damage. And I think the synonyms listed were liable, and endangered, exposed. I'm still shocked. So we experience perhaps our greatest moment of vulnerability when we transition from this life and this body. And that is out of our control. Across disciplines, certainly in psychology, but also in philosophy, religious studies, and so forth, many have proposed that the underlying fear of all fears is our fear of death. So being embedded in several yoga and mindfulness communities, I have met many people who would say that they have been able to kind of shed that fear. And I have no reason to question that. But I've also observed in those same communities a major lack of willingness to be vulnerable. And I'm not claiming to have an outline of why that is, but it's something I've observed. So if death perhaps feels too intangible right now, or maybe even too close to real due to the times that we're living in, what does it look like with love? Many of us have felt the fear of loving too much, the fear and the pain of loving due to our concern with potential, or maybe even in certain cases, certain loss, right? because with loss comes grief. And many of us have been denied the opportunity to mourn openly and healthily. Grief and mourning are essential aspects of healing. And in healing, we are strengthened. But when deprived that, we harden, and our emotional resilience is starved of those lessons of healing and growing. What does hardening look like on any given day? It could be impatience with different points of view. It could be defensiveness or feeling the need to prove your point. It could be lashing out in moments where you feel vulnerable or weak or judged. It could be judging in order to feel strong. What does hardening look like for you on any given day? Where do you recognize deficits in your emotional resilience? If our fear of loss is underlying our fear of loving, then what remains open to us? What do we gain by controlling our lives in this way? Those are questions that I'm not providing answers for, but I would like to leave them with you. But where does that leave us now? How can we begin to surrender to the truth of having little to no control over most aspects of our lives? And how do we practice acceptance without it leading us down paths of complacency, apathy, hopelessness, or despair even? So for me, I think the first thing that has really helped in my confronting this over the last 8 to 10 years or more is, for one, that the clarity and recognition that it doesn't actually change much. We never had the control that we bought into. And I would propose that most of us knew that somewhere. We knew it, maybe we didn't acknowledge it, but we felt it. Some life experience forced us to reckon with it. The next step is practice. Practice in everyday situations. So anyone who's heard me speak in the last 12 months, especially anyone, I'm sure there are people on the call who were with me in Portsmouth last year when I spoke in person. But anyone who's heard me speak or has spent time with me in the last year has heard at least one story about my puppy. I guess technically she's not a puppy anymore, but eternal puppy in my heart. Her name is Hunter. She's a Welsh Terrier. I brought her home in January of last year when she was 10 weeks old. And she's been like my greatest teacher. That's what I keep saying. She has really bluntly shown me how little control I have. Beyond the pains of potty training, she has denied me any sense of control. So in some ways, she's a very, very well-behaved dog. And if you have any experience with Welsh Terriers, you also know that they are extremely cheeky. She's also a living being with a mind of her own that can't be helped. When we take walks, and she quite literally just runs circles around me. But I bring her up for this. After one of the many times when I found myself frustrated after she had yet again like weed or pooed in the house, I don't remember which one it was, someone asked me, what would change if you knew that she would one day get it? What would change if you knew that she would one day get it? I didn't really have an answer, but I did have a realization after the question, because the majority of her bad potty behavior was to a certain extent my fault. She has certain food sensitivities. It took a while to figure that out. She loves yogurt, and if she gets a spoonful too much, it's a little too much for her bladder to hold. So I'm not claiming that my frustration has completely dissolved. It hasn't, but something shifted with that question. So I'd like to offer it to you. Take a moment and think about just one thing, one situation where you find yourself gripping the reins and trying really hard to control it. Get specific with yourself right now. What about you? What about this situation? What are you trying to steer that is defying you? And while you think about that, feel into your body and notice where it comes up for you. What would shift if you knew with certainty that it one day wouldn't matter? This one thing that you're trying really hard to control, what would shift if you knew with certainty that it one day wouldn't matter? You might not have the answer in this moment, but stay in touch with your body because it's surely talking to you right now. I'd like to close with a poem from Audrey Lorde. For those of you who might not be familiar with her, she was born in New York City. She was a librarian. She was an author. She was a Black woman warrior poet. And this poem is called Coal. Coal is the total black, being spoken from the earth's inside. There are many kinds of open, how a diamond comes into a knot of flame, how sound comes into words, colored by who pays what for speaking. Some words are open like a diamond on glass windows, singing out within the crash of sun. Then there are words like stapled wagers in a perforated book, buy and sign and tear apart, and come whatever wills all chances, the stub remains. An ill-pulled tooth with a ragged edge. Some words live in my throat, breeding like adders. Others know sun seeking like gypsies over my tongue to explode through my lips like young sparrows bursting from shell. Some words bedevil me. Love is a word, another kind of open. As the diamond comes into a knot of flame, I am black because I come from the earth's inside. Now take my word for jewel in the open light. So I feel like I've talked enough, a lot, and I'd love to bring Claire back and open up this conversation to all of you who have joined us.
Thank you, Stacie, for the meditation and the talk. I have never been invited to notice sensations on the crown of my head before. That was really different. And at first I noticed thinking, there aren't any sensations. Then suddenly there was kind of a buzz of activity and and then holding sensations on the crown of my head and in the belly just below the navel. Very different experience. Thank you. Really powerful.
Thank you.
And the talk about control very much resonated with me, and the words during the meditation. I think you said we have no control over it. No.
In control of none of it.
That's it. Yeah.
In relationship to all of it.
All of it. Yeah. Very much spoke to me. And I've been noticing myself over the last week or so, feeling really tight and not all the time. That kind of controlling tightness coming in all of a sudden, not seeing it coming with my daughter, with my husband, like losing my patience quicker, and then noticing trying to control, why are you doing it like that? And then
and then it becomes a cycle.
Absolutely, it really does. So yeah, very much spoke to me what you were talking about. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that feedback. Thank you.
No, it was really, really powerful and thought-provoking. Like you say, we haven't got the answers for things. It's just having the questions to ask yourself,
right,
to reflect on. Really powerful stuff. Thank you. So I'll just see. Stacie would welcome questions at this point. And I know some of you are not going to be able to stay for the rest of the session. So just a big thank you for joining us this evening if you do have to go before we finish, and just a gentle reminder about if you can offer us any support, offering Dana a donation, then you can use the button at the bottom, offer Dana donation button, and there's a link posted in the chat, and I will post it again as well. So thank you. So I have a question from Daniel. He said, you talk about hardening, and when I hear that, lots come up for me around the subtle and explicit experiences of rigidity. Rigidity of how things or people should be, how things are assumed to be, or how things get done. I think, and understandably so, there is a lot of expectation and hope that things will go back to normal soon. Can you talk about how people might be hardening around their ideas of how things will be after this initial period of pandemic?
Ooh, big question.
Yeah.
Diving right in. It's a great question, and it is actually something that I'm always in conversation about with people. I'm always asking people two questions. One, if there's just one thing that we as a collective, it might be, in the US specifically, or in the UK, or wherever you might find yourself, if there were just one thing that you would hope that we would collectively realize and agree on, what would it be? And for a lot of people, that question goes immediately into the political. In the US, people talk about universal health care, better benefits for people at work. I haven't heard anyone answer that question, or like the first thought to be around themselves. even if it is, I'm asking about a collective, but it always comes back to us, right, as individuals. Two things in that question that stand out for me is one, the notion of should. So I'm also a coach, and many of my clients will know that I don't like the word. Should is problematic because with should we have a lot of pressure coming in from different places, and it just doesn't exist. We should be meditating more, but we're not. We should be exercising more, but we're not. So what does should even mean in like the greater scheme of things? If that's not what we're doing, what would be much more helpful is to be present in those moments when the should comes up. Where is the should really coming from? Is it coming from me? Is it coming from expectations of friends? And then the notion of normal, I think, is a tricky one because that it also doesn't exist. It's normal doesn't exist in the sense that sure, we have our statistics and we have our bell curve that tells us what normal looks like based on a group of people, but normal right now means staying indoors. That's normal. And when I lose my resistance to this notion of normal, then some of that stress and anxiety and fear that comes up for me is released because I'm not comparing it to something that no longer exists. Going forward, we have to ask ourselves something that I would ask all of you on the call. What are 3 things that you've learned about yourself in this time? I'm sure some of you have already had that, as soon as I said it, you had your 3 things. And some of you were like, oh, wait, I've never thought about that. But what are the 3 things that you've learned about yourself during this time? Start with those. And not in a judgy way. Oh, I'm really bad at this. Oh, I'm really good at this. Oh, I should be doing this. 3 things stated, such as I, in quarantine, am more intentional about my eating, for example. I eat in silence, or I cook more elaborate meals, or I take the time to cook more. It could be anything. And what does that mean for you, first and foremost? Those 3 things that you've recognized, that you've learned about yourself. I think it's very important to let go of these notions of should and normal and let go of a desire to go back to something that no longer exists. We don't know how long we'll be in quarantine, and we don't know how this will progress, if we'll go back into quarantine. And so really instead of hanging on to the news and expectation of that thing that you want to hear, what could happen if the mindset shifts to, this is what I'm doing now, and this is what it's taught me about myself now?
Thank you, Stacie. I was pondering that while you were saying that, actually. What have I learned about myself? Because there was definite loads of thoughts beforehand about spending this much time with my daughter with no break, and not wanting her in front of a screen for so long, and how can I serve the community, being at home and not being on the front line as I would normally be. And actually, it's amazing. The reality has been so different to what the mind had predicted before.
Right.
Actually, it's been a much joy in spending quality time, slowing down. It's just amazing, the power of that.
Absolutely.
yeah, there's so much I'm learning and doing this. Never in a million years, even 3 weeks ago was like, no, can't do it, not doing it. And here I am.
You're already a pro, I told you.
So it's just a really lovely reminder of however much the mind predicts or that hardening, and kind of actually just sitting back and what is going, how is this actually? How is
Right.
this? So it's so powerful. There's another question.
Sure.
Can you talk about your thoughts on this idea of hardening in relationship to returning to normality? Oh, okay. So that is, I think we have covered that with your lovely answer to that question.
Sure.
Does anybody else have any other questions they'd like to ask Stacie?
I have not checked chat, so if there were any questions in the chat, I will not have seen those. So please use the ask a question button.
How do you think this pandemic will affect Dharma communities and how they operate?
I don't know if I'm necessarily qualified to speak to Dharma communities specifically, but I will speak more broadly to community. I think to some extent, what we're seeing is community does not have to be geographically based or limited. And sometimes when we're in a geographical space together, we're not nearly as intentional as we are right now. So it's been very interesting seeing so many offerings coming up on different platforms that people are using, and people taking part in it, right? Who wouldn't otherwise have had the opportunity to do so. I think more than anything, we can hope for more intentionality in connecting, less assumptions around how we connect and with whom we connect. I'd also hope that the pandemic serves as a wake-up call to the necessity of all of us to become really engaged with the systems within which we live. So we see with this pandemic that marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted, not only health-wise, but now also financially. And so I would hope that takes the Dharma communities and the yoga communities and other communities, it takes them towards action. So a lot of people talk very philosophically about the guidance and teachings of these different systems, and I see very little translation into daily action. And so what I would hope, I can't say that it will happen, but what I would hope for is the opportunity being taken up to really change how we build community, how we maintain and nourish community, and how we bring action into community.
Thank you. That's really important. And yeah, I think it's the action, isn't it? However much intention or heart opening practices or well-wishing in our practice, actually, unless we do other behaviors in line with changing those situations, things are not going to change.
No, not at all. Well-wishing is certainly not enough. Sending love and light it's not going to change the situation.
No.
No. And it's not going to change minds either. So we have to be very intentional now.
Yeah. Yeah. And how you spoke of the communication, actually very intentional. I've certainly noticed that. It's just a different way that I'm paying attention. It feels more focused and actually feels more connecting at times, even though I wouldn't have thought, again, online that you would be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a question that I'd like to ask, if that's okay.
Sure.
Just to ask about, I'm finding with myself being new to sort of social media and having a smartphone again after having 2 years off of one. It's been a real shift. So trying to find that balance between how much engaging with news updates or online connections, and then how much time to step away, because I can notice I'm drawn to my phone just to check, even though there's, it's just like a habitual behavior.
Right.
And in terms of news, actually, myself personally, I've chosen a lot of the time to stay away from updates. So I noticed some judgment going on for myself as to I'm not as aware as I should be, or to the devastation that's going on. I'm just finding that, trying to find the balance of how much screen time, how much engagement, without sending myself into a judgmental panic.
Right.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I talk about a lot, actually, with boundaries. I think boundaries are really important, including how we use our phones and other forms of media. So I'm probably also not the best person to ask because I'm really strict about it. So I don't have a TV license. I only watch Netflix on I only give myself like Fridays and Saturdays for that because I have a huge backlog of books that I want to read. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m., which gives me the chance to choose if I'm going to look at the phone anytime after 9 p.m. rather than being disturbed by it. I'm using silent mode a lot more often. But also, I left a lot of WhatsApp groups just to give myself a breather because there was just too many links being shared, too much potential for misinformation being disseminated. But we all have to figure out what works for us. And what I ask people is feel into yourself. Can you be present while you're on social media? If you're scrolling Instagram, can you check in with yourself? After 2 minutes, after 5 minutes, after 10 minutes, check in with yourself. How do I feel now? Because when we recognize the connection between how we feel and whatever the particular action is, if it's going on Twitter to get the latest COVID-19 update, if it's going on Facebook to connect with, see what our friends and family, whatever the action is, connecting it specifically to what we feel in the body. And I find it then much easier to change the habit. Again, not working from I should be on social media less, but really working from an embodied experience. When I'm on Instagram for more than 5 minutes, I don't feel good. So then it's easier for me to come out of it, right? Or if I go on Twitter and see all of these stats, I feel overwhelmed or helpless or whatever it is. So then I make the decision to maybe only do that once a day, and at a particular time of day where I know myself to be more resilient.
Yeah, thank you. It is. I guess it's kind of going to be an experiment of trying different things and seeing, but actually, ultimately, it's connecting back in with what is my present moment experience. How is this impacting me?
Right.
Because sometimes it can be really subtle and I'm not noticing. It's kind of a slow build up, and then there's been other times where people have shared things that I've read, and then it's sent my body into almost a spasm.
Exactly.
And I've gone, don't send me that stuff, please.
Exactly. Yes.
I'm choosing not to look at this other stuff.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely boundaries. So thank you very much. I'll just see. Okay, I have another question. From Lorraine, I experienced it as difficult to sense my power, etc., when you invited us to bring our attention to the area just below the navel, second chakra ? I didn't have a strong sense of this at all. Could you suggest any practices to strengthen the sense of power? Sorry, I lost the question.
That's okay, but I think I've got it.
In this area.
Okay.
In my understanding, this area may also be associated with creativity and difficulties with intimacy, both of which are relevant to me. Can you speak to any of this? Thank you, Stacie.
Sure. So the chakra system is one way of looking at it. I was working with Hara, which is Hara, which originates in Japanese culture. But either way, it's very similar. And so it's absolutely normal to, in that moment, not have felt anything. And there's no reason to force it, right? So it was, as you use the word, it was an invitation to tune into what was happening there and perhaps tap into a feeling of being centered and steady. If it's something that you have practiced more than just today, then I would ask you, is it just an experience that you had today? Maybe it was just today. Maybe it was just in this moment. Maybe if we did it now, it would be a different experience for you. If it was your first time practicing it, I would say, that's fine. It was a new experience. So maybe the sensory experience was more important in that moment than feeling whatever you may associate with power and knowledge and creativity. But if it's something that you would like to continue to work on, then maybe you can include it in your practice. When you practice, you can take however long you sit, you can take a few minutes, just bringing your awareness again back into that area and allowing the sensory experience to take the lead rather than focusing on particular mindsets, so to speak. And I would also say, again, there's not any one way to do it. So I wouldn't put too much pressure on yourself if you didn't have that experience today, because it's just about practice. And the beauty of the mind, even though it can feel like it's bothering us and it's doing all this thinking, the beauty of the mind, though, is also when you ask it a question, it continues to work on it without your having to bring any effort to it. So now that you have this practice and this experience and this invitation, when you come back to it the next time, it will be different. And then you come back to it another time and it will be different again. So more generally, I would just say, feel free to integrate it into a daily practice. You can try, even if it's about not even the sensory experience being available to you, you can try to strengthen the core area with a few exercises. But it's all just about practice. And I would encourage you not to put yourself under pressure that it needs to feel a certain way. Even after practicing 5 years, it doesn't have to feel a certain way.
Thank you. There's another question. How do you manage the intensity of the updates in the news around what is happening?
Great question. I don't watch the news at all. Again, I don't have a TV license. I go on Twitter in the mornings, and they have like a bulletin, and I read it. And then I prefer to go directly to sources. So there's a research report that I read every night from qualified sources, such as in Germany, it's the Robert Koch Institute. In the US, it's Johns Hopkins or the CDC. And I use the Deutsche Bank as well. So I just read. And so I have a very different approach to it, because I have friends who work at the NHS. I have friends who work at the CDC and family. So I know that there are very real things happening, and I have to limit how much I take in, because I feel like media has a different purpose. And I feel like to a certain extent, they've kind of lost their original purpose in how they report. And so for me, I just prefer to take the other people's emotions out of it, so that I can just read the numbers and what's happening in the different spaces to understand the extent and the severity of what we're experiencing right now. So I would encourage you, maybe if you find the news is not working for you, to move to some other form of information to stay informed.
Thank you. There's one more question. This will be our final question from Nilu. How do we surrender without feeling disengaged? Are there specific practices you can recommend? Thank you, Stacie.
Thank you, Nilu. Great question. I'm going to assume that it is a Nilu that I know. And this is exactly what I was talking about. I think it can be very difficult when practicing surrender to feel like there is, especially for people who are really politically and socially engaged, for activists, the word surrender just doesn't sit right. It doesn't sound like that it would be in line with their values. Practicing surrender without disengagement, that's what I was trying to refer to a bit with, the notions of complacency and apathy. Our practice of surrender starts again with ourselves. And so those 3 points that I was making, let's just, for the sake of this question, let's go to point 2 with the desire to control in order to project self-worth. How can we practice surrender? By reminding ourselves that our worth isn't dependent on the job, the salary, the people who love us, the accolades, and whatever else that, to a certain extent, society has led us to believe. So I practice surrender by reminding myself that my value as a human being is not tied to my productivity. I practice surrender by integrating self-care into my daily life. So self-care isn't, it is also going to the spa or getting a massage or a petty mani, but self-care is also looking in the mirror and speaking positive affirmations. Self-care is a daily gratitude practice. Self-care is nourishing myself with food that I know makes me happy, tastes good, and is also good for me, right? And in doing those things, I continue to build on what I already have inside of me, but kind of in this process of unlearning much of what society has burdened us with, coming back to this innate wisdom that I, as I am enough, and surrendering the reins of having to prove to anyone else that I'm enough.
Thank you. What a great question.
Well, I'd like to say thank you again for being invited to share space and hold space with the Southsea Sangha and wider, greater community. it's been a real pleasure and also a real process in preparing and getting my thoughts together for what I wanted to talk about today, and also allowing myself to be vulnerable and telling my childhood story. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Stacie. It is really lovely hearing your words and your experiences, and so relatable and thought-provoking. So thank you so much for coming today and supporting our Sangha. We really appreciate it deeply. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We thank you in advance for your generosity. And I'm going to post a link for where you can find, in the chat, I've just posted a link for where you can find videos of the sessions that we've got these Sundays. Next week we have our very own Southsea Sangha Daniel leading a practice at 6 o'clock next Sunday. And also want to say thank you to Sangha Live for allowing us to use their space as well. So hope you all take care, and thank you for being on this journey with us together. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nothing to write home about. Nothing to write home about. Nothing to